Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us, those who are here in person, those who are joining us virtually. But all of us are here with very broken hearts. All of us are here with very heavy hearts. And all of us are here with a lot of questions. A lot of questions, a lot of doubt, a lot of uncertainty that spans a lot of different realms, from the theological, the spiritual, the religious, to the interpersonal, and to how to relate to and support, best support, a family that we love very, very, very much. So, sometimes Hashem sends a refuah before a makkah. Sometimes Hashem sends us the healing and the strength even before the affliction. And in this case, Hashem gave the world a great gift called Chai Lifeline. And they're a lifeline. They work for the Moskowitzes over the last 13 months. And on occasions, I had a front row seat to see that chesed, that loving kindness. And those gestures, which weren't gestures, but the things that were taken care of in ways that unburdened a family who needed to focus on something else. And so much more than that, Chai Lifeline is a lifeline of support and of love and of wisdom and of direction. And I want to thank the leadership and the people can't even look in your direction. That's why you're going to do most of the speaking tonight. Just introducing the evening. But there are malachim, there are angels here on earth, make no mistake about it. And they're not on billboards, they don't have millions of followers online, they don't appear on the covers of magazines, but they are nothing short of Hashem's angels here on earth. And we thank them from the bottom of our hearts. And one of those angels, one of those gifts to the Jewish people is Rabbi Dr. Dovid Fox, Shlita, an extraordinary human being whose bio does not do justice to how special a person he is, how instrumental role he has played and continues to play, now for us in our community, and particularly for the Moskowitz family, but for Klal Yisrael and beyond around the world. Rabbi Dr. Fox, forensic and clinical psychologist, director of crisis intervention, trauma and bereavement support services for Chai Lifeline International, a graduate school professor. He's published in scientific journals. He serves as a rabbi in LA, as a dayan in the rabbinical court in the Beis Din of Yerushalayim. He's published widely. He's on the board of Nefesh, the American Psychological Association, Association of Psychological Science, National Register of Health Service Psychologists. The list goes on, and I don't want to take up of our time. You get the idea, but what doesn't appear in print or on paper is a person's heart and soul. How genuine, how real, and how much empathy they carry, and how much wisdom they share. And for that, we are eternally grateful, and grateful that you're with us. So before I turn the mic over and really ask the first question and get the conversation started, two Rav Hirsch comments on etymology. One on the word avel. Mourning, grieving, person who's mourning is an avel. It's avelus. And it's not a coincidence. Rav Hirsch says the word avel comes from the word aval. However. But. Because for the avel, everything is different. Whatever was happening and whatever was true and whatever was one's life, the avel feels aval. It's come to a standstill. It's stopped. However, but it will never be the same. Things are different. And they're different for the family that we love, that has inspired or motivated this evening's gathering. It's different in a very different way for all of us who feel connected and who love and who feel broken and traumatized by this tragic loss. There is a collective sense of grieving and of avelus, of avel, which is aval. However, things are different. Rav Hirsch had another observation and etymology, and that is that we don't ask, famously he says, we don't ask lama, why, but lama, for what. The why we'll never get an answer to, and I can't speak for Rabbi Fox. I am as plagued as you are, and I have my list. I have my list, which now has another bullet on it, and unfortunately is growing. For when I get upstairs, we all have the lama questions. Why? How? What? How could it be? But that's not the purpose of tonight. That's not why we're here. That's not the answers that we're providing. It's not answers, at least that I am even at the beginning of capable of providing. It's the lama. For what? How can we grow? What can we learn? How can we react? What can we do? How can we process? And how can we be the best friends that we can be? And the last word of introduction before I turn it over is that, well, of course, tonight is all about the Moskowitz family and Esti, Alea Shalom, Esther Tehila Bas Rav Gavriel Pinchas. But we're not going to speak about them in particular because the details is their privacy, but rather in a larger picture what it means to experience loss and how we react to it. And as I said, among the things that we're grateful for in moments like this are the people that Hashem has sent us, and I'm sitting next to one of the most special. So without any further ado, thank you, Rabbi Fox, for being with us this evening, coming from Los Angeles to be with our community and to support our community and to help us through this difficult time. And if we begin by, please share with us a little bit about trauma and what it means for a family and the next concentric circle of community, what it means that we go through it, that we experience it, how to react to it, some broader introductory comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a deep and true honor to sit next to you and to learn from you, and just to get a glimpse of the magnificent and, I would say, famous congregation that you built in this community. I don't want to speak academically about what trauma is, but your community has experienced a trauma. A trauma is an experience, a tragic experience that no one has an immediate way of knowing how to handle it, how to organize their thoughts and their feelings, including their theological thinking, and the loss of a young child to a good family in a supportive and loving community is a traumatizing event for everyone who has any relationship with that grieving family. Again, a trauma is virtually any type of catastrophic event, especially one that involves loss of life, that isn't natural. Ramban writes for us that what makes the grief over the loss of a child so difficult and so challenging is that it doesn't conform with our assumptive reality. The notions we have about the natural course of reality, that children are supposed to outlive their parents. Loss of a child means that the parent has unnaturally outlived their own child. And Ramban says, this is of course hundreds of years ago, that the wound to a parent is immeasurable and not comparable to other losses. And that's a trauma. Objectively, that's a trauma. But neighbors and family and siblings and grandparents, aunts and uncles, rabbis, rebbitzins, congregants, co-workers, classmates, also are part of what's called the ripple of trauma anyone who had any type of emotional investment in praying for this child, in being supportive to her parents, in talking about what's happening and what's going to happen. So anyone who's part of that ripple in the broader community becomes a witness to that trauma. And this is not an exaggeration. For what it's worth, this is what our science is showing us, that witnesses to a tragic loss very, very commonly get swept into that same reaction, that same range of reactions that we see in the family themselves. There's the heaviness, there's the sadness, there's the confusion, there's sometimes anger, there's fear and other types of anxiety, and there's also people not feeling good physically. And what we're seeing in that ripple throughout a community, when the community has sustained this type of traumatizing loss, is that there's going to be an interval of time when people struggle. All of us. Whether, as we said, you were friends or neighbors or relatives, or mispalalim, or you might have been involved clinically in offering supportive services, but anyone who had an investment, an involvement, an interaction with the family, you carry some of that same distress. So this is what trauma is. This is what trauma does. It's not an over-exaggeration to say that everyone who's here tonight didn't come to be entertained, but came, as the rabbi said, with that question of lama. What do we take from this? And some of us also have the question of lama. Why did this happen? But this is the nature of a traumatizing event, how it flows throughout a community, and we carry our thoughts and our feelings and our reactions. And let's hope that in the course of talking tonight, we can look at some tools for helping ourselves, helping our children.
So before we get to the children, which is a key factor, and I think why many are here tonight, let's talk about ourselves. So we can identify that we're experiencing the ripple. It's important to distinguish, of course, between being a primary subject of the trauma and the ripple. Sometimes people can insensitively or inappropriately project, or one should comfort in and dump out, and not the opposite. So it's important to know that we are the ripple and not the primary person of the trauma. So we identify and we can feel it. We can feel it in our health, in our concentration, in our body, in our emotions. Do we just lean into it and say that it'll take some time to resolve, time will heal it, we've gone through something? Or is there something actively we should be doing to be able to both honor the tragedy, the loss, the pain we're feeling, but simultaneously process it in a healthy way that it won't leave or embed permanent imprint?
So, psychological science has been studying grief for about a half a century. And we've been studying trauma for a little bit less time than that. This is what we know just looking at the evidence, looking at the data, that it's normal to react to bad news. It's not particularly normal to have no reaction. It's normal to react to bad news, and it's very important for our mental hygiene, staying well and staying stable. It's very important to take time and garner some awareness of how we react, and to also acknowledge that we are reacting. Again, it's not particularly normal for a person to be part of that community rippling, knowing what has happened. Not particularly normal or healthy for a person to take it in stride and move on. So our general first step in addressing a community, or in addressing an individual or a family who have experienced a traumatizing event, is to take time and look at how you're reacting. And it does take time. It's not a flash self-study, but it's really taking time to look inside yourself as adults and to observe. When I focus on this, what goes through my head? And when I'm not particularly focused on this, what's going on inside of my head? Am I having trouble concentrating? Am I having a lot of flashback images of this child or of her parents? Are there thoughts, or sometimes even words, or sometimes sounds associated with this that I can't seem to get out of my head? Am I obsessing about certain things, or I'm worrying a lot more, maybe even less rational worries? Am I overprotective? So we want to be self-aware, starting with what's going on inside of our heads. It's very normal for bright thinking people to react to bad news by carrying it in their thoughts. And that's part of our self-awareness. Now obviously, although I started with thoughts, there's another layer of us, and one which unfortunately we don't spend enough time indulging in, and that is our emotional selves. There are a lot of feelings that commonly erupt inside of us when we learn of serious illness, when we learn about death, when we learn about loss of a child or any loss in a family that we care about. And those feelings, we know some of those well. We know what sadness is. And we know that sometimes we cry. And sometimes we shudder and we sob. And we know that sometimes the Lama question, although it is more of a theological, cognitive question, but it brings up frustration and anger inside of us, and we have this feeling, this isn't right, this shouldn't happen. That feeling of not wanting it to be there, and somewhere between disbelief and denial and resentment that something like this happens, and that takes up a lot of emotional space inside of us. And let's face it, we have our thoughts, we have our emotions, and many of us do react in our bodies, particularly when we have feelings that we keep inside and we don't express. They morph into physical changes, real physical changes, even changes inside of your brain circuitry, measurable, observable, radiologically observable changes in the way the brain is operating. But we get our stomach aches, we get our headaches, we get our pain in the neck and our pain in the back pain. And our blood pressure can go up. Or we can feel very sleepy. Or we can feel faint, weak. Or some people get restless and can't sleep. But there are a lot of body reactions associated with absorbed distress. And we want to be aware of those too. And of course, we want to look at our behavior. Are we acting differently? Are we socially withdrawing? Are we laughing too much? Are we sarcastic and cynical, which sometimes accompanies feelings of hurt and anger? Are we less patient and less tolerant? Or behaviorally, do we have less drive, less interest, less motivation? Those are behavioral changes. And also, back to the theological, people do sometimes carry their distress after trauma. They carry it into their spiritual functioning. Some daven a lot more and say a lot more tehillim, and they make nidarim, and they make vows, and I'll never ever do this again, or I'm always going to do that, and they develop a sort of zealousness, reactive to fear that this could happen to us or happen again. And some feel very estranged spiritually. All those tehillim that we said, all of those tefillos that we launched, all of the tzedakah that we gave, all of the zechuyos that we accumulated, and where did it go? And people are plagued by those questions sometimes, and it's not a childish feeling of lama. And that is a spiritual place. It happens that one opinion in Chazal is that that's actually quite an accomplishment, to feel that cognizant of Hashem, that you're aware that you don't feel close to Him anymore. That sort of paradoxical feeling. But whether it's good or whether it's not good, people react spiritually. So self-awareness is something we all want to invest in. We all want to take that time and just scan within. How am I responding inside of myself, in thought, in emotion, in body, in behavior, and in my spirit? So self-awareness is foundational in being able to deal with or face the challenge of hurt following traumatic loss. And again, sticking to the science, the self-awareness, we want that to then lead to self-expression. Holding this in, it erodes our mental hygiene, our wellness as people. Holding in those thoughts that bother us, holding in those feelings that torment us, holding in what we're already holding in when our bodies are reacting, and not being able to find someone who cares about us and who we care about too, who we can have the pretty much uninhibited ability just to talk out what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and whether it's turning to the rabbi or to the rebbitzin, or turning to your spouse, or turning to your close friend, but turning to someone who you trust and who cares about you. And when someone turns to you and says, look, Dr. Fox says it's important to inventory what I'm going through and then to talk it out, Someone who, when you talk it out with them, won't give you quick solutions, won't judge you or criticize you for the way you're reacting, won't try to cheer you up or tease it out of you, and someone who will just listen supportively and acknowledge that this is how you feel, this is how you think, this is what you're going through, and you're having this reaction because your brain and your body and your soul are having a difficulty because someone else had a tragedy. And that part, it's not just the catharsis of psychotherapy, of getting it off your chest, but it's being able to hear yourself think, putting it audibly into words. So that your brain, literally, your brain can start reorganizing how it's rewired itself because of the gasp of when you heard about the end. That moment that jarred something loose in your brain's wiring, it happened. I'm not making this up. I'm not being picturesque in portraying something that's just a metaphor. This happens to us when we hear about tragedy. And we want to look at it. We want to be aware of it. We want to know what is going on where inside of us. And then we want to turn to someone and we want to put it into words. And someone who will listen receptively and supportively and not try to talk us out of it, or not try to distract us from our feelings and our thoughts. They will ease out of you. Most of us here have had prior exposure to trauma, and we know that with time it does ease out of us, but it'll ease out of us in a way that's more natural and more healing if we first know about our reactions, and then we take the time to talk them out.
So identify it, don't suppress it, and express it. And even though that might sound for some instinctive or intuitive or obvious and come naturally, for others less so, they think they're being more heroic, or what's the point? We're all sad, why talk about it? Why do I need to express it? It's obvious we're broken, but that suppressing it and that bottling it can stunt a person or compromise a person in those ways, mentally, emotionally, and with their physical health. So even if it's not tangibly processing it or processing it with a therapist or expert, simply communicating it and expressing it and releasing it is an enormous help for trauma. The person should make that time and find that person and find the courage, because sometimes it takes courage to do it. You have to trust the person, you have to trust yourself, you have to be willing to be vulnerable, and that's the first thing in terms of not suppressing it. How would all this relate to children? Many are concerned for children. If we have questions and we can't process and we can't make sense of it, all the more so from children who I'm sure also begin to ask themselves, maybe I'm next. What does this mean for me? How did this happen to her? I thought children become adults. They don't have funerals. So they're seeing parents and adults who are crying, don't know how to make sense of it. They're themselves filled with questions or confronting their own mortality or fragility without using those words. And so what can one do for their children to get them through this difficult time?
Such an important question. What do we offer our children when they're also part of that ripple, either because of being a classmate or a neighbor or a friend, or just knowing that the whole community gathered here for a funeral, and they're hearing about it in school and at recess and in the grocery store. So what do we do as parents? So first, let's remember that a child's reaction is going to vary with their age and their maturity. And very young children have no concept of death. They don't know what terminal, final, finality, always, forever, never again. They don't know what those time-linked concepts mean. And we don't have to go and impose grief on a child who doesn't need to be grieving. Very young children. And very young children, children 4 and younger, unless they are showing us strong indications that they're in distress, there's very little that we would need to say to a child that age. We don't have to bring them into a state of tearfulness or fear. Now, school-age children, especially if they had some relationship with the Nifteris, with Esti, Aleh Shalom, or with their siblings. They were classmates or friends or playgroup members, but whatever, if they had a relationship, so they are going to take their cues from you as parents. Which means if they see that you're burdened and you're sad, they'll pick that up. If they see that you're stoic and not showing anything, they'll learn from that example. And you may end up oblivious to covert reactions that they may be having. So younger children, school-age children, they worry. They don't know exactly what it means that there was a death. They don't know exactly what that means, but that they know it wasn't good. And they know it had something to do with sickness. And they may become more nervous when they hear people talking about sickness and illness. And you may need to be attentive to that. That a child may need a clarification that what happened to Esti was very rare and very unusual, and it's not like getting the flu or getting a cold. So we may need to do some corrective education of children so that they're not terrified that anyone who doesn't feel well is going to die. So you may need to do that elementary educating. And young children don't yet have empathy, which means they're not going to be concerned about the parents or expressing pity or sadness about their situation. They're going to be worried about themselves, and they're going to be worried about you and something like this happening to them or to you or someone else that they know. And they may ask a lot of questions because they're not empathic, meaning that part of their emotional life is still ripening. So they may instead ask a lot of questions and ask for a lot of facts and ask for a lot of details. And you don't have to answer all the questions. You don't have to get involved in distracting questions. You can compliment them on their questions. But you don't have to have all sorts of detailed information for the child whose anxiety is coming out by wonderment and questioning. What we want to do with younger kids, our younger children, is ask them what they know and what they've heard. You'll sometimes be astonished at what they've heard, whether they overheard mother and father talking, or whether they heard a distorted version of what happened. But we want to start the discussion. Tell us what you've heard. And tell us what's going on. How did you react when you heard that? What did you think? And what did you feel? And I don't believe parents or anyone else should be plying children with lots of questions and probing, but instead prompting them to talk. And if they have a very distorted version of what they've heard, correct it and just say that wasn't it. And if they have some type of monstrous amplification of what happened, correct that right away. That's not what happened. But you don't have to give them all of the facts. And you do have to have a discussion with those elementary age children, but don't have it at the dinner table and don't have it near bedtime. Let them have mealtime, hopefully with the intact family, and let that be a time of comfort, both gustatory comfort and family bonding time, but not talking about bad news, not talking about scary things, not talking about other people. Upgrade the quality of mealtime, but don't get into talking about the morbid or the frightening. And the same thing is when a child is preparing for bed at that age. It's a time to sort of ease them into dreamland, but not into bad dreams. That's not the time to have this discussion. And give your children reassurance that they're well and that their siblings are well. And give your children a lot of love at this time. And the love at this time can't be overestimated because we know the pasuk says, "V'hacha yitena libo." Those of us who are still living, we take this to heart. One of the things we take to heart is that there are two parents who can't give any more love to the little girl. And that brings closer to the heart of parents the Chai Lifeline libo, that double and triple your display of tenderness and caring and loving to your young kids. Kids who are loved and kids whose parents caress them and embrace them in appropriate ways and are encouraging of them and don't belittle them and don't criticize them and don't make fun of them. So those children grow up loving their parents and having an interest in people. And this is a time where really part of the healing of parents is to perhaps not be overprotective of your kids in an irrational way, but keep them close to you and let them know your affection. So let's just move on because it's a very significant question the rabbi asked, but let's cover the different ages. So when children are approaching adolescence, let's say roughly that age of chinuch, which is like 8, 9, up until bar or bas mitzvah. So they are more likely to have emotion reactions. They are more likely to express sadness or to become moody or to become less compliant. Children are approaching, they're not quite at puberty, but they're approaching adolescence. Their emotions become much more part of their conscious life. And we can't reprimand them for being moody or sad at a sad time. But we can, as we would with our spouse, we can encourage them to talk about what's going on. And if they have a hard time expressing them, let them draw about it or color about it or write a poem about it. But it's important for them also to express what's going on. And if you're close to your child and they have the gift of being able to open up to you verbally, so make use of that gift and prompt them to talk about their feelings.
For a lot of that age children, might this feeling be foreign to them? Meaning previously sadness was they didn't get an extra slice of pizza or their favorite cake. And this is a whole other level of sadness, and it's an experience entirely unfamiliar.
Mm-hmm.
And that might also create anxiety for that child, aside from the feeling itself. So should that be addressed in terms of legitimizing or validating what they're feeling or what the sadness is or why this sadness is altogether different?
So I'm not surprised at the wisdom of the question, knowing the wisdom of the rabbi, but that is a very wise observation. Let me offer that even we take the word chinuch, so to be mechanech our children means to guide them through a new experience, to guide them through a new stage of life. And yes, this type of sadness, the sadness of avelos, of grief, hopefully for most of our children, it's foreign territory. They haven't had this type of sadness. They haven't dealt with loss. Even some younger parents here may not have had this type of loss experience before. And so part of our being mechanech them, part of our guiding them, is to introduce them to the normality of feeling pain and feeling sadness, knowing of someone else's loss. Younger kids are focusing more selfishly, and selfish is not abnormal when you're young, but they're self-focused. And what's important is their own sense of loss. For example, I've seen orphan children, and one of the first things out of their mouth when they've learned that their parent has died is, "Who's going to make my lunch for school tomorrow? Who's going to put me to bed? Who's going to drive carpool?" Literally, younger children, they're thinking in the immediate, what am I going to do now? Who's going to take care of me now? But when children begin to mature in that age of chinuch, they're beginning to think, they're beginning to recognize that someone else hurts, and that's hurting me. And it's not even, going back to something the rabbi said, it's not even the imo anochi vatsara, which doesn't kick in until we're teenagers. Empathy is not part of the pre-teen brain's circuitry. There's a lot of studies. In fact, some of the first studies came out at the University of Miami way decades ago. Some of the first studies on this, by coincidence. I know this isn't Miami, but it's close. But children are not even in that, at this age, are not even in that imo anochi vatsora, where they're empathically troubled by someone else's trouble. They're closer, what Yeshaya the Navi says, B'kol tzarasam lo tzar, that when someone else is in distress, they're hurting because it hurts them, which is not the same as I'm concerned about how much it hurts this other person. So listen to your children, teach them about grief, teach them about sadness, teach them about the ideal value of learning to be considerate of another person's feelings. And be patient with them, because kids in that age range, they go through a type of grieving, but it's more likely to be the moodiness or the irritability or the impulsive acting out. Now, when we get into teenage, all sorts of hormonal and neurochemical changes are part of our body and brain experience. And young people start taking life more seriously, and they start having very intense feelings, and they start showing empathy, which means concern about someone else's plight, and it bothers them that someone else is having to go through this. And you are going to get challenges sometimes from your teenage children or students. Like, what kind of a God is this? This isn't fair. We prayed and we gave our charity, and now what? Why? And be patient with those children also. And then you're being mechanech, that post-bar or bas mitzvah child. If you can have that theological discussion with them and that perspective forming, and you're blessed with the ability to have that talk with your children, do that. And if you can't, or you don't have the knowledge to explore their spiritual questions, you tell them that let's figure out who you see as your role model and your mentor when it comes to religious struggles. Is it the rabbi? Is it the rabbi's wife? Is it a particular teacher you have in school? Is it someone else? Is it your uncle? But if you can't have that conversation with your children, so prompt them, give them the gift of someone who they can wrestle with with the struggle. It's a healthy struggle. It's part of their becoming an adult, a thinking person. But, and I'll slow down with this last aval, but, paraphrasing Rav Hirsch. When your children or your teens or you yourselves are plagued by the lama questions, don't attempt to give them answers. The questions that begin with the word why, that have to do with God or have to do with life, the existential as well as the theological questions that begin with why, we usually can't come up with an answer that will satisfy another person. What might click or make sense for me probably won't help the other person. And it's hard enough when I'm going through hard times. It's hard enough for me with all the cheshbon hanefesh and with all the other things we try to do. It's hard enough for me to figure out why this happened to me. But don't risk trying to settle the child's agitation and confusion by offering them an answer. And instead teach them that the question right now is more important than having an answer, and it's a question to wrestle with. It's a question that will take years, or at least months, of trying to get perspective. And then maybe at certain points, stuff will begin to fall into place. But we can't try to surgically end the confusion of another person by coming up with a simple answer. You laud them for the question. You praise them for their empathy. You compliment them for having profound, deep, sensitive thoughts. But stop short of trying to give them answers.
Until now we focused on ourselves, our self-awareness, our processing, and doing that for our children. But maybe my last question before we open it up for questions, which I think is very, very important and on all of our minds too. Our community sent out, I think, a fairly well done suggestion or guidance for the Shiva. How to behave, how long to stay, things to avoid saying. And during this acute phase of Shiva, hopefully provided some guidance. There was a last paragraph in it which was somewhat ambiguous, and that was only because we struggled for how to fill it in more meaningfully, and hopefully you can for us, which is, in the phase after the acute phase of Shiva, when a family, we're speaking generically, is trying to re-enter community and get back to life, I would say normal life, but it will never be normal again, aval, it is forever different for them, there's this sort of dichotomy, which is to treat them as if everything is normal, which might be what they crave, is cruel. To express sadness and corner them or go up to them in a supermarket or in a minyan or at carpool, which is attempting to be an act of kindness, can in fact land as cruelty. So could you give us some guidance as what we do? What do we do? What does one do, I should say? What does one do? How do we straddle that line and find that balance between we want to allow you to re-enter and create a new normal, so we're going to go along with your new normal, versus we don't want to be callous and ignore that something monumental, catastrophic has happened and we're not going to act differently around you. How in that next phase, not the acute of Shiva, how can we best help them into that next phase?
Okay. Getting up from Shiva for many Orthodox Jews is when the grieving starts. We have Hilchos Avelos and Shulchan Aruch and Yoredea, and those are the laws of mourning. And the laws of mourning involve the practices, the rituals, the behaviors, the customs. Those are Hilchos Avelos. There's very little reference in Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Avelos to grieving, because mourning are the behaviors. Grieving is what's taking place subjectively. And there are not a lot of halachas about how people go about grieving. And Shiva is the launching of the Avelus rituals. It's a practice, it's behaviors, it's restrictions, it's customs. And so much is going on during Shiva. If any one of you has experienced Shiva, certainly anyone who's gone to a Shiva house, if we look at it objectively, so a lot of us don't know what to say, and we may end up distracting the person from their grieving with well-intended stories we tell them and sharing that we do. But whatever happens in Shiva, when it's over, that's often when the grief begins to deepen, it begins to set in the emotion, the pain, the spiritual. And so let's consider that anytime a family gets up from Shiva, that from that point on, certainly through Shloshim, they're going to be encountering and trying to figure out how they grieve internally, how they grieve with one another. And our task in allowing them to re-enter Earth's atmosphere and to gradually find their footing and returning to shul and other involvements. So our task is, when we see them, not to bombard them with all sorts of questions, not to try to force them to talk. Most people report, and we're now at a stage in Chai Lifeline that we have been for about maybe 9 years, we're surveying, we're gathering data when we speak to people about the Shiva and the post-Shiva. So I'm relaying information to you that's sort of evidence-based. But most people don't want to feel pitied. They don't want you to be crying and looking sorrowful more than they are. And it comes from a holy place inside of us when we want to show that we're sensitive to their pain, but when we're crying more than they are, or we have a look on our face of agony that's more intense than theirs, people don't like that. People emerging from Shiva, they don't want to feel pitied. So they don't want to be questioned. Most of them don't want to feel pitied. They also, and this is the paradox, they don't want you to ignore them. They don't want someone passing them in the aisle of the grocery or in some other location and looking away or going down the other aisle. They don't want to feel that somehow they have become taboo, or as if they're somehow contaminated in some way. That makes people feel very uncomfortable and unwelcome back. I generally suggest that we don't ask the rote questions of, how are you doing? Or, how are you feeling? That's not a welcome question. I also suggest that we don't project or assume that we know what they're going through. For example, even the innocent statement of, this must be so hard for you, or you must be in such pain. Now that's true, but it's not helpful to say it to someone that they must, or we don't want to presume to know what they're going through. It's also not helpful if someone has been bereft in their own way to approach someone and say, I know exactly what you're going through. Or, I went through this. I get out of it. You'll emerge from it too. It's not helpful to be told, you've got to be strong. They'll find their strength when they'll find their strength, but those are not helpful opening lines with a person. So again, the questioning them, the pitying them, the over-identification, the presumptuousness about what they must be going through. What can be helpful is to say, it's good to see you. What can be helpful is to say, welcome back into the synagogue. What can be helpful is to say, these are some things I can do that might be useful to you in the next week because you've got a lot going on. Show me the ones that you want. Meaning to give concrete offering of the shopping or the carpool or something else, as opposed to, if there's anything you need, let me know. Which keeps the door closed. Most people are not going to take you up on an ambiguous offer. But if there's something that you think you can do that's helpful, tell them, I'd like to do this for the next week. I'm going to help with the shopping. But concrete offering to do something, that can be helpful. And another thing I'm going to suggest, any sentence that begins with the words "at least" should not be said to a person after Avelis. Because it's well intended, but we've all heard, well, at least you have other kids. Or, at least she's in a better place. Or, at least you know she's dancing with the Shekhinah near the Kisei HaKavod. So any of those at least statements, they're like jabbing someone with a needle. It doesn't make this parent feel better knowing that, thank God, they have other children, by telling them that, well, at least you have other children, so this loss, it could have been worse. So we want to avoid statements like this. And let's say use our seichel and use our heart, and don't be a burden on this person, but be a welcoming, caring person. And those would be my recommendations.
Basically, take the cue from them. If they seem sad, you can react with sadness, but if they're not displaying that, your opening comment was, don't show more agony than them, and I've heard you say that you should not say, it's unhelpful to say things like, I can't stop crying, this was so hard for me, we're so broken. We shouldn't project, or that's not appropriate, and it's unhelpful to sort of make them now bear the burden of our pain. Even though we're doing that to show empathy, don't think that we've moved on, I'm broken, but that's unhelpful as well, correct?
Yeah, I professionally and personally think that when we're approaching someone who's in SAR, that the less we talk about ourselves, the more we will touch their heart. The more I talk about I and me, the more I take the focus onto me, then the less caring I come across. Because we go to the pasuk in Eicha, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, he says, Im yesh machov kamachovi. Yirmiyahu is lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem as if he was Jerusalem in its Churban. And he says, Im yesh machov kamachovi. Could anyone ever understand the pain that I have? And when someone else comes along and talks about how much pain your pain caused me, so you can't understand my pain. You're not going through what I'm going through. And that's why use of I, use of self in speaking to someone who's getting into the grief, it's taking a jab at them.
Rabbi Dr. Fox, this has been so insightful and given us a lot of guidance. We want to open the floor for a couple minutes if anyone has any questions or further clarification. We'd ask you to not be specific, of course, about any particular family, but in general about the comments, identifying our own reaction to trauma, not suppressing it, expressing it, processing it, communicating with children, validating them, and being mechanech them through this, and a guidance on how we can help a family re-enter the atmosphere of community and of life, or on anything else. Any follow-up clarification? Any questions? I'm sure Rabbi Dr. Fox will make himself available for a couple minutes to stay as well, if anybody wants to follow up. So on behalf of our community, I want to thank you and thank Chai Lifeline for all that you've done, all that you are doing, and all that you continue to do for the Jewish people, and we are here to assist and support your incredibly holy work. So thank you so very much, and please God, in the future we should gather only to learn about this academically and theoretically, and never personally and directly. And we're grateful, we're so grateful for your wisdom and for being with us tonight. Thank you so much.
There was a question.
There was a question, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. The question was, we have a general guideline now about how to approach parents who are bereft. What about our own children approaching their children? That's the question, I believe. Okay. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I had meant to talk about it. And thank you for the reminder. So we have spoken to a number of the schools in guiding the faculty about addressing their classes where there may be a sibling returning into that class. So these are the guidelines that we feel are most sensitive and effective. So best friends should remain best friends. If a child is really one of the best friends of a bereft or grieving sibling, so they should return to being the best friend. And being a best friend at a time like this might mean saying, if you want to take a walk and talk about how you're doing, I'm here for you. And if you don't want to talk, but you'd like just to take a quiet walk, I'm here for you. That's best friends. Mediocre friends should not try during this time to become best friends. It comes across as artificial. It's like, as they say, saccharine sweet. Remember saccharin? I don't think they have it anymore, but I'm old. Those who are classmates or acquaintances but didn't particularly have close relationships, this is not the time to rush in and try to become the close, intimate friend. But whether you're a close friend or a mediocre friend or just a classmate or didn't really have a relationship with a child, our opinion is that in the first week or so when a child returns to school, everyone should make an attempt, one-to-one, quietly to go over to the returning sibling and welcome them back and say, I'm glad you could come back to class. Or they can say, if you need help catching up on the work, I took notes for you. But everyone retains the boundary that they had, the nature of the relationship. No one tries to change that. No one should shun a child. And you'll tell your kids that what they went through, and there's nothing spooky about them. There's nothing contagious about what they went through. And there's no cause to feel uneasy or nervous around them. So encourage your children just to let them be, not to, same as with adults, not to ply them with all sorts of unnecessary questions. And if a youngster says, I really don't want to talk about this, or I'm not ready to talk about this, or just, I prefer not to be asked questions, then your child should be told to respect that also. But the child should not feel that they're on display. They should not feel hyper-pitied. They should certainly not feel that they're being ignored as if there's something weird about them. And this is not a funny joke, but I joke that in Chai Lifeline, everybody knows that RSS stands for Rabbi Simcha Scholar, who's our founder. But in my department, RSS stands for routine, schedule, and structure. And mental hygiene rests on those three pillars: that getting back into routine and returning to one's prior schedule, and making sure that you structure your time in a healthy way. This is how people rebound, and this is how people re-regulate and find the equilibrium. And it'll happen for that family. It will happen for all of those in the Kehillah who care about them. You'll return. You'll find your groove. You'll find your zone. And your kids also. And those children also, they'll get back into the routine. And the structure and the schedule of routine, living in that familiar life cycle, again, that does bring with it a certain degree of healing. Yeah, are there other questions that anyone would like to raise? Yeah, and that's wonderful that a youngster would have that sensitivity, that they're worried or concerned that they might say something triggering, and commend your child for expressing that. Praise your child for them having already reached that ability to empathize, to be concerned about another person, and to be careful about not triggering them. It is true that if we bring up topics which are thoroughly insensitive, like making jokes about sick people or dead people or dying people, not only is it not tasteful, but it can trigger. On the other hand, we get asked by teachers, tomorrow's Parsha lesson is about the death of Sora Imenu, should we skip it? Or tomorrow's Mishnah, we're talking about the person who gets killed by the ox. Should we not talk about it because it involves death? So generally what will guide a teacher, will guide a parent, will guide a child is that if you're concerned that something might be upsetting to the child, so the teacher would go over to the child and say, tomorrow this will be the lesson. Will you be uncomfortable in class if we bring it up? And we found most of the time kids say, look, if it's learning, it's learning. You shouldn't do a different curriculum because of me. That'll make me feel weird. And everybody will know that you're skipping Chayas Sora because of me. So that's generally what we say, but you can coach your children, prompt your children that use taste and sensitivity in what you talk about, but the normalization of speech and the normalization of the relationship as the friend returns to school, that will feel right to those kids. And most children, although they are young, they're malleable. They'll bounce back, and they have loving, caring parents and attentive teachers who will be on the lookout to see if the child is suffering. But help your children, commend them for their sensitivity, go over the obvious things not to bring up, joke about, or talk about, but tell them that by and large, you just return to the type of relationship that you had. I know it's late and I don't want to keep you. I don't think there's any more questions. Am I right or wrong? Okay, but I mentioned to Rabbi Goldberg when we spoke earlier today that I want, if I may, with your permission, I just want to share a midrashic thought that I came across a few years ago. Perhaps some of you have seen this midrash. It's not brought by the classic commentaries on Chumash, but it's an expression. We all know what a sapphire is. Some of us wear them, or we bought them for our wives. A sapphire is a beautiful blue gemstone, and the color sapphire blue, we know that vivid, translucent, sparkling blue. But really, a sapphire is not blue. A sapphire is a transparent stone, and depending on the minerals in the soil in which it's found, it can take on red, yellow, blue, or other colors. So what does the word sapphire mean? So one of the roots of the word sapphire in Greek is from the word we have in English, superior. The sapphire is called a sapphire not because it's blue, because it was considered a superior stone. So the word sapphire means superior in English, and one conjugation of the Greek. And in this week's Parsha, we're told that Moshe Rabbeinu, he has this vision of the divine, of the giving of the Torah, and he sees this image as if beneath the space where he can somehow perceive the divine presence. He sees this kamasa livnas hasapir, which all of the Bible English translated as the blue sapphire brickwork. It's a very strange image. Moshe Rabbeinu saw blue sapphire brickwork. What was brickwork doing in heaven, and why blue sapphire? So there's midrashim on that, but I found a medrash. Maybe rabbis, sure rabbis come across this also. But it struck me, there's a few versions of the medrash, but this one, it's painfully sweet how our great sages wove this lesson into those words. And they say that this was not the Maaseh Livnas Hasapir. It was not the brickwork. Maaseh Livnas wasn't the intricate brickwork that was like the sapphire stone. But what this pasuk means is k'maaseh, like the maaseh, as we say, the maaseh, like the incident of the superior stone. That beneath the kisei hakavod, there was the incident of the superior stone. Now, what in the world does that mean, the superior stone? Livnas hasafir, the superior brick, the superior stone, and the incident involving it. So there's a medrash that says that there was a Jewish woman, a slave woman in Mitzrayim, working hard and carrying bricks. And at a certain point, trying so hard to carry the burden and just wanting to try her best and wanting to shoulder this burden and do her work. And someone put one brick too many on her back. And the child she was carrying miscarried and died. And she shrieked to Shemayim that she was trying her best and doing her hardest work. And this is what she has to show for it, is the loss of her child. And the Medrash says that maaseh, that incident of losing a child, that was represented in Shemayim, with all of the finery and the regal possibilities of materials to symbolize Kisei HaKavod. The one that Hashem Kaviyachol held on to was the Livnas Sapir, the most precious, superior stone that marked the pain of a mother who lost a child and who turned to Hashem. And this family has lost a Livnas Sapir, a precious stone. And it was a long ma'aseh. It was a very long ordeal for them and for you. And we don't know why, but we know the tears that we're still weeping, and we know that we have a sense of the profundity and the torment of what they're going through. And this was not a sacrificial offering. This is not something they wanted. This is not a gesture they were making to please Hashem. This was something that was followed by tza'aka, by the agony of loss. We can't comfort them. Now's not the time. We're not menachem, a person, shemesam utal lefanehim. The Mishnah says we don't even try to give them nechama when they're still preoccupied with lust, but maybe something we can aim for as a loving, close, cohesive, very expertly led kehillah is that we'll ask Hashem to look at this superior stone that's coming from your community and merachem on all of us.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Fox. Thank you all for being here. Please God, we should gather to celebrate and mark happy occasions. Thank you.